Good evening, everyone. I am Dr. Sudha Udaya, your trainer and assessor for your building and construction program. It gives me great pleasure to welcome each and every one of you to Builder Academy and, more importantly, to welcome you into one of the most important industries in Australia, the building and construction industry. Today is not simply the beginning of another course. For many of you, today may be the beginning of a completely new professional journey. Some of you may already have many years of experience in construction. You may have worked as carpenters, painters, plasterers, concreters, tilers, electricians, plumbers, supervisors, or tradespeople. Some of you may already be managing people. Some may be coming from another country and learning how the Australian construction industry operates. Others may be entering construction management for the first time. Whatever your background, I want all of you to understand one thing from the beginning. You are entering an industry that Australia cannot function without. Look around any Australian city, every house in which somebody sleeps, every apartment building, every hospital, every school, every university, every shopping centre, every factory, every office building, every warehouse, every aged care facility, every hotel, every car park, every community building, every piece of infrastructure connected to those buildings exists because somebody understood how to convert an idea, a drawing and a vacant piece of land into a completed physical structure. That is construction. And construction is much bigger than laying bricks, pouring concrete, or installing timber framing. Construction is a complete value chain. It involves planning, design, approvals, estimating, contracts, procurement, materials, people, plant and equipment, safety, building codes, Australian standards, quality management, project management, supervision, inspection, certification, and ultimately, responsibility. As you progress through your Certificate 4 or Diploma of Building and Construction, I want you to change the way you see a building. Today, you may look at a house and simply see a house. By the end of your studies, I want you to look at that same house and see the site, the classification, the drawings, the footing system, the structural system, the materials, the trades, the construction sequence, the contracts, the cost, the risks, the Australian standards, the NCC requirements, the inspections, and the compliance obligations behind that finished product. That is the difference between simply looking at construction and understanding construction. Before we begin discussing codes and classifications, I want you to understand why what you are studying matters. Australia is facing a major housing challenge. Under the National Housing Accord, Australia is working towards delivering 1.2 million new well-located homes over 5 years. Government and industry forecasts have repeatedly shown that actual construction is struggling to keep pace with this enormous requirement. Depending on the forecast and the time at which it was prepared, projected gaps have been in the order of hundreds of thousands of dwellings. One official forecast projected a shortfall of approximately 262,000 homes, in other words, close to 300,000 homes against the target. Think about what that means. We are not discussing 300 houses. We are not discussing 3,000 houses. We are talking about a challenge measured in hundreds of thousands of homes. Behind every one of those homes are families. Young Australians trying to purchase their first property. People trying to find affordable rental accommodation, new families, older Australians, migrants, workers, students, communities. So when Australia talks about solving the housing problem, there is something very important that we must remember. You cannot solve a housing shortage without constructing housing, and you cannot construct housing without people. You need tradespeople. You need supervisors, you need estimators, you need contract administrators, you need project managers, you need site managers, you need construction managers, you need building professionals who understand compliance. Jobs and skills. Australia continues to identify significant occupational shortages, with trade occupations remaining among the most affected and construction being one of the areas experiencing persistent skills pressure. Construction is already a major employer. Jobs and Skills Australia estimated the Australian construction workforce at approximately 1.348 million people in May 2025, with employment projected to grow to around 1.508 million by May 2035. So I want you to recognise the opportunity in front of you. But I also want to make something very clear. A skills shortage does not mean that someone automatically deserves a job. A qualification does not automatically make somebody a competent builder. An employer does not employ a certificate. An employer employs a person who can demonstrate knowledge, judgment, communication, responsibility, and competence. Therefore, your responsibility during this course is not merely to pass assessments. Your responsibility is to become somebody that the construction industry wants. Someone who can walk onto a construction site and understand the conversation. Someone who can read a drawing. Someone who understands specifications. Someone who knows the difference between a regulation and a standard. Someone who understands what happens before a footing is poured and what happens after lock-up. Someone who can communicate with a carpenter, concreter, engineer, architect, surveyor, building surveyor, supplier, and client. That is what professional development means. There is something I want every student to understand from your first day. Construction has its own language. Imagine arriving at a hospital and hearing doctors discussing a patient. They have terminology that allows them to communicate precisely. Construction is exactly the same. On a building site, you'll hear words such as set out, footing, slab, frame, load-bearing, non-load-bearing, RL, datum, specification, tolerance, variation, prime cost, provisional sum, lock-up, fixing, finishing, RFI, SWMS, NCC, BCA, Australian Standard, performance requirement, deemed to satisfy, contractor, subcontractor, certifier, building surveyor, and occupancy. These words are not simply academic vocabulary, they are working tools. If somebody says, "We have reached lock-up," you need to understand what that means in the construction sequence. If an engineer refers to structural loads, you must understand the context. If the drawing and specification contain different information, you must know how to investigate it. If a contract contains a requirement that refers to an Australian standard, you need to recognise its importance. If a building surveyor asks how a proposed solution demonstrates compliance, you need to understand the question. That is why I encourage you from today to create your own construction vocabulary. Every time you encounter an unfamiliar term, write it down. Find the definition. Understand it. Use it. Do not simply memorize the word for an assessment. Connect that word with what happens on a real project. Because one of the biggest transitions you will make in this program is moving from simply knowing how to do a task to understanding why the task is performed in that particular way. That is the transition from trade thinking to supervisory and management thinking. Now I want you to look at the construction value chain diagram in your presentation. At one side, we have vacant land. At the other side, we have a completed building structure. Between those 2 points is an entire industry. The presentation takes us through the physical construction sequence: demolition, ground clearance, foundation, frame, including walls and roof, lock-up, fixing and finishing. Let us think about what happens. We begin with the land. Before construction can properly commence, existing structures may require demolition. Then comes ground clearance and preparation. But even before we start digging, many questions have already been asked. Who owns the land? What is permitted on the site? What is the building classification? What approvals are required? Where are the boundaries? What is the soil condition? Where are existing services? What drawings have been approved? What does the contract require? Then we progress to foundations. The foundation transfers loads from the building into the ground. That means structural design, soil conditions, concrete, reinforcement and tolerances become important. After foundations, we move towards the structural frame, the walls and the roof. Now we need to coordinate materials, trades, drawings, structural requirements and installation sequences. Then comes lockup, then fixing, then finishing. And eventually we arrive at the completed structure. But look at the diagram again. The construction process does not operate by itself. The presentation identifies 4 major stakeholder inputs entering that value chain: material supply, human resources, plant and equipment, and compliance. Think about those 4. First, materials. You cannot construct without concrete, reinforcement, timber, steel, masonry, plasterboard, waterproofing products, insulation, glazing, roofing, and hundreds of other products. Materials must be selected, ordered, scheduled, delivered, stored, protected, and verified. Second, human resources. Even with perfect drawings and unlimited materials, nothing happens unless skilled people perform the work. Construction requires tradespeople, supervisors, engineers, designers, surveyors, suppliers, administrators, and managers working together. Third, plant and equipment. Excavators, cranes, concrete pumps, scaffolding, lifting equipment, power tools, access equipment, testing equipment. Every stage requires appropriate resources. And fourth, and this is extremely important, compliance. Compliance does not suddenly appear at the end when somebody asks for a certificate. Compliance must travel with the project from beginning to end. That is one of the most important ideas I want you to remember from today's session. Compliance is not the final stage of construction. Compliance is part of every stage of construction. This is why your Certificate 4 and diploma contains such a wide range of units. You are not studying unrelated subjects. They are different pieces of the same construction value chain. Both programs address areas such as applying structural principles, site surveys and set out, labour and material scheduling, construction contracts, reading plans and specifications, estimating costs, preparing sketches and drawings, tender documentation, site communication and administration, legal requirements, and applying building codes and standards. Think about how beautifully those topics connect. Before construction, site surveys, planning, drawings, estimating and contracts. During construction, structural principles, materials, labour, supervision, communication, safety and quality. Across the whole project, legislation, codes, standards and contractual obligations. For students undertaking the diploma, your learning moves further into management. The programme addresses Type B construction, structural principles for buildings up to 3 stories, project quality, stakeholder engagement, building applications and approvals, on-site planning, management of construction work, legal obligations, business finance, business risk, WHS risk, contractor management, environmental management, cost monitoring, and professional technical and legal reporting. For Certificate 4 students, your additional learning includes waste minimisation, leading and managing teams, workplace health and safety, planning construction work, project quality management techniques, procurement and storage of materials, and building science principles relating to energy-efficient buildings. I want you to understand why the curriculum is broad. A builder does not have the luxury of saying, "I understand the timber frame, therefore I do not need to understand the contract." Or, "I understand the contract, therefore I don't need to understand safety." Or, "I understand the drawings, therefore the NCC is somebody else's responsibility." Construction management requires you to connect all of these areas. That is why I call this a value chain. Each activity affects what comes next. A mistake at set out can affect the entire building. Incorrect foundations can affect the structure. Poor procurement can delay trades. Poor supervision can produce defects. Incorrect waterproofing can cause major failures. Poor documentation can create contractual disputes. And non-compliant construction can prevent a project from achieving the outcome for which everybody has worked. Now we come to one of the most important pieces of vocabulary in the Australian building industry: building classification. When somebody tells you that a project is a Class 1 building, Class 2 building, or Class 9 building, that number is not simply a label. Classification tells us about the purpose and use of the building, and this connects directly with the NCC requirements that need to be considered. Let us move through the 10 classes. Class 1 generally deals with houses and certain small residential accommodation. Class 1A includes a single dwelling or one of a group of attached dwellings, such as a terrace house, row house or townhouse. Class 1B can include a small boarding house, guest house or hostel within the parameters set by the classification requirements. When many people imagine building, Class 1 is often what they first visualise, the Australian house. But our industry goes far beyond houses. Class 2 concerns apartment-style buildings, buildings containing separate dwellings where people may live above or below one another. Once we move into multi-unit residential construction, coordination and compliance become increasingly complex. You are dealing with multiple occupants, shared building elements, fire separation, access, services, acoustic considerations, and many other requirements. Class 3 covers residential buildings other than Class 1 or Class 2 arrangements described in the presentation. Examples include certain boarding houses, hotels, motels, guest houses, hostels, backpacker accommodation, student accommodation, and workers' quarters. Again, think about how occupancy changes risk. A private house occupied by one family is not identical to a building in which many unrelated people sleep. That is one reason classification matters. Class 4 is particularly interesting. It is a dwelling located within a building that is otherwise non-residential, typically within a Class 5 to Class 9 building. The example in your presentation is a caretaker's residence associated with another type of building. So one physical structure may contain areas serving different purposes. This is why classification requires understanding rather than simply memorizing 10 numbers. Class 5 is an office building used for professional or commercial purposes. Think about offices occupied by accountants, lawyers, government agencies, and other professional organisations. Class 6 generally involves buildings in which goods are sold or services are supplied directly to the public. Examples from your presentation include shops, restaurants, hairdressers, public laundries, shopping centres, funeral parlours, and showrooms. Ask yourself, would the safety and access requirements of a public shopping area be exactly the same as those of a private home? Obviously not. The way a building is used affects the way it must perform. Class 7 includes particular storage and car parking uses. Class 7A relates to car parks. Class 7B relates to warehouses, storage buildings, or buildings used for the display of wholesale goods. Think about the completely different activities that can happen inside a warehouse compared with an apartment. Different occupancy, different fire loads, different circulation, different services, and different risks. Class 8 generally relates to process-type buildings, such as factories and buildings, used for production, assembling, altering, packing, or cleaning goods or produce. The examples in the presentation include a mechanics workshop, abattoir, and laboratory. Again, the use of the building determines the risks that must be considered. Class 9. Class 9 relates to public buildings and is divided into important subclasses. Class 9A includes healthcare buildings such as hospitals and day surgery clinics. Class 9B includes buildings where people assemble for social, theatrical, political, religious, educational, sporting or civic purposes, including examples such as schools, universities, sporting facilities and nightclubs. Class 9C includes aged care facilities. Think about the people who might occupy a hospital or aged care facility. Some occupants may not be able to evacuate quickly or independently. This demonstrates why building classification and compliance cannot be separated. Finally, Class 10 concerns non-habitable buildings and structures. Your presentation identifies Class 10A, such as sheds, carports and private garages. Class 10B, structures such as fences, masts, antennas and retaining walls. And Class 10C, private bushfire shelters. Now you can see the bigger picture. We have moved from a private dwelling in Class 1 all the way through apartments, accommodation, offices, retail, warehouses, factories, hospitals and other public buildings, and finally non-habitable structures. So when somebody says, "I work in construction," my next question might be, what construction? Residential, commercial, industrial, healthcare, education, warehousing, retail. Each area is part of construction, but the compliance environment is not identical. Now we connect those classifications with the National Construction Code. This is the point where many new students initially become confused, so I want to make the relationship simple. Think of the NCC as the National Technical Framework. Within the framework presented in your learning materials, we have 3 volumes. NCC Volume 1. Volume 1 primarily deals with the building requirements relevant to the classes of buildings covered by that volume. Your presentation shows areas including governing requirements, structure, fire resistance, access and egress, services and equipment, health and amenity, ancillary provisions, special use buildings, and energy efficiency. It also contains specifications relating to matters such as fire-resisting construction, fire hazard properties, external walls, fire-protected timber, cavity barriers, smoke-proof walls, fire doors, and service penetrations. And importantly, the NCC includes state and territory appendices. Therefore, you cannot study the national framework and then forget where the building is being constructed. A project in Victoria must be considered within the applicable Victorian legislative and regulatory environment. A national code and state or territory building legislation work together. NCC, Volume 2. Volume 2, as illustrated in your presentation, connects strongly with Class 1 and Class 10 buildings. This includes requirements dealing with matters such as structure, damp and weatherproofing, fire safety, health and amenity, safe movement and access, energy efficiency, ancillary provisions, additional construction requirements, and livable housing design. You will also see governing provisions relating to interpreting the NCC, compliance application in states and territories, referenced documents, documentation of design and construction, classification and united buildings. This is why understanding classification comes before trying to navigate detailed requirements. First ask, what are we building? Then, how is it classified? And then, which NCC requirements apply? Then, which reference documents and Australian standards are connected to those requirements? That sequence of thinking will serve you throughout your career. NCC, Volume 3. The third volume illustrated in your presentation addresses plumbing-related requirements. You will see areas covering water services, sanitary plumbing and drainage systems, excessive noise, facilities, governing requirements, referenced documents, documentation, and state and territory provisions. So when we stand inside one completed building, we are actually looking at the result of many interconnected systems. Structure, fire, access and health, amenity, energy, water, drainage, electrical systems and materials, workmanship, all connected. Now we reach a very important compliance lesson. The PowerPoint explains that the Building Code of Australia, or the BCA, is represented by Volumes 1 and 2 of the NCC, and it distinguishes between standards that become mandatory through legislation, or NCC reference, and other Australian standards that may otherwise operate as technical guidance or become enforceable through contracts, WHS laws, or regulatory requirements. This distinction matters. Students sometimes think it is an Australian standard, therefore every clause automatically has the force of law. That is too simplistic. The important question is, how has that standard become applicable to this project? Has it been referenced by the NCC? Has legislation called it up? Has the building contract required it? Has the project specification required it? Has another regulatory requirement made it applicable? The presentation gives you several important examples. AS1684 relates to residential timber-framed construction. AS2870 relates to residential slabs and footings. AS-NZS 3500 deals with plumbing and drainage. AS-1170 deals with structural design actions. AS-3600 concerns concrete structures. AS-3700 concerns masonry structures. AS-4100 concerns steel structures. AS-NZS 3000 contains the wiring rules for electrical installations. AS-3959 relates to construction in bushfire-prone areas. AS-1851 addresses maintenance of fire protection systems and equipment. AS-2118 deals with automatic fire sprinkler systems. AS-1530 addresses fire testing of building materials and structures. AS-NZS 4858 addresses wet area membranes. AS-1926.1 deals with swimming pool safety barriers. And AS-NZS 1170.2 specifically addresses wind actions. Now imagine being responsible for a project and not understanding these connections. A timber-framed house, a concrete slab, a masonry wall and a steel structure, a bathroom waterproofing system, a bushfire-prone site, a swimming pool, a fire sprinkler system. These are not isolated technical subjects. They form part of the regulatory and technical environment surrounding construction. Your presentation makes another important point. When an Australian standard is referenced through the NCC, the relevant referenced requirements become mandatory, but sometimes only particular sections or clauses are adopted. It also notes that publication of a newer edition does not necessarily mean that edition automatically becomes the applicable legal requirement. Adoption through the relevant NCC and regulatory framework matters. That is why professional builders do not simply say, "I remember what the standard said 5 years ago." They check, they verify, they document, and if they are uncertain, they obtain appropriate professional advice. That is professional responsibility. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to finish where we started. You are joining this program at an extraordinary time for the Australian construction industry. Australia needs housing. Australia needs infrastructure. Australia needs skilled tradespeople. Australia needs competent supervisors. Australia needs construction managers. Australia needs professionals who can manage quality, safety, cost, time and compliance. But above all, Australia needs people who are prepared to learn. So during this program, do not study only for your assessment. Study so that you can walk onto a site and understand what is happening. Learn the vocabulary, learn to read the plans, understand the specifications, understand the sequence, understand contracts, understand costs, understand quality, understand safety, understand people, understand the 10 building classes, understand the NCC, understand the relationship between the NCC and BCA. Understand why Australian standards matter. understand your state and territory requirements, and understand that every decision you make as a future builder or construction manager may affect cost, quality, safety, compliance, and ultimately the people who will use that building. When you next drive past a vacant block of land, I want you to see more than vacant land. I want you to imagine the complete value chain, the planning, the demolition if required, the ground clearance, the foundations, the framing, the walls, the roof, the lock-up, the fixing, the finishing, the trades, the materials, the plant, the contracts, the supervision, the inspections, the standards, the NCC, the compliance, and finally the people walking into a completed building. That transformation from land to a safe, compliant and functional building is the industry you have chosen to study. And somewhere within that enormous value chain is your future career. Some of you may become registered builders, some may become construction managers, some may become project managers, some may become site supervisors, some may work in estimating, some may manage contracts, some may establish your own construction businesses, and some of you may eventually employ and mentor the next generation of tradespeople. But everybody begins in the same place, by learning the fundamentals. Today is that beginning. So I encourage you to ask questions. Do not be afraid to say, I don't understand that terminology. Do not memorize without understanding. Connect theory to what happens on the construction site. Whenever you study a new subject, ask yourself, where does this fit into the construction value chain? Whenever you read an NCC requirement, ask, which building classification am I dealing with? Whenever you see an Australian standard, ask, why does this standard apply? Whenever you look at a drawing, ask, what happens next on site? And whenever you make a decision, ask, is it safe? Is it compliant? Is it buildable? Is it properly documented? If you develop that way of thinking, you will be doing much more than completing a qualification. You will be developing the mindset of a building professional. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Builder Academy. Welcome to the Australian building and construction industry. Welcome to an industry with enormous challenges, enormous responsibilities and enormous opportunities. I look forward to working with you throughout this journey. Thank you, and I wish every one of you every success in your studies and in your future career in building and construction. Welcome to the program.